All right. Ivanka Trump believed she'd managed the impossible escape. While her father navigated courtroom warfare and her siblings faced witness stands, she'd accomplished something nearly unachievable in American political theater. She remained untainted. She constructed a brand identity. She departed Washington with her reputation preserved, her fashion enterprise memories dissolving, her Miami existence resembling the flawless departure from turmoil. For years, legal professionals whispered that she'd possessed sufficient intelligence to maintain separation. For years, that assessment appeared accurate, until the day a subpoena materialized bearing her identification. And not merely any subpoena. Documentation that drew her directly into the nucleus of the identical financial universe that recently cost her father $355 million. A legal confrontation capable of dismantling everything she'd invested a decade constructing. The inquiry everyone's posing currently is straightforward. How profound does this penetrate? Because when you observe what investigators have genuinely uncovered, when you comprehend the chronology, when you recognize how extensively this has been accumulating behind sealed chambers, you'll grasp why her attorneys are allegedly experiencing sleepless nights. This isn't regarding politics. This concerns documentation, figures, authorizations, and a documentary trail that persistently redirects to the identical family designation. So, let's commence at the origin, because this didn't materialize overnight. And if you exclusively absorb the headlines, you're overlooking the narrative that genuinely matters. Ivanka Trump invested years cultivating a remarkably precise image. She was the refined one, the centrist, the daughter capable of sitting opposite world leaders without generating scrutiny, who could address the United Nations, who could navigate the West Wing in professional attire and make it resemble governance. She possessed distinct energy from the remainder of the family's public presentation. Gentler, more sophisticated, meticulously regulated. That image was her defense mechanism, and it functioned remarkably effectively. While her father's enterprises faced microscopic examination, while her brothers Don Jr. and Eric endured depositions and court manifestations and expiation, Ivanka maintained her separation. She was designated as a defendant in the original New York Attorney General inquiry, but that was preliminary stages. When the case contracted, she wasn't in the final courtroom. When Engoron delivered his determination her name wasn't attached to the penalty, people registered this. Legal commentators stated she'd executed it intelligently, departed early, collaborated sufficiently. The prevailing perspective was that Ivanka had managed the impossible, escaping the gravitational force of a legal void that consumed nearly everyone surrounding her. But here's what those commentators weren't observing. The investigation didn't terminate simply because one case concluded. The individuals who invested years documenting the Trump Organization's financial methodologies didn't collect their files and depart. They continued excavating. And what they discovered in those files, deep within the documentation of transactions executed during Ivanka's tenure as executive vice president, is what's generating the current legal pressure descending on her now. Because Ivanka wasn't merely a peripheral figure in the Trump Organization. She operated projects. She authorized documents. She was thoroughly embedded in specific real estate transactions that are now positioned at scrutiny's center. The Chicago Tower, the hotel licensing arrangements, the negotiations with foreign governments during the period when she possessed a White House security clearance while maintaining private business concerns. The overlap is the complication, and investigators have possessed years to chart it. Here's where the narrative pivots and where most coverage fails. People presume Ivanka's legal exposure is merely spillover from her father's case. A proximity complication, culpability by association. That's not what the documents indicate. Her potential exposure is precise. It's connected to her own actions, her own representations, her own role in deals where the figures didn't align. During the civil fraud trial that buried her father, testimony surfaced about the financial statements the Trump Organization executives assisted preparing and certifying. Ivanka's involvement in certain of those statements, particularly around the period when she was actively operating on deals, is what investigators are examining now, not as a footnote, as a focal point. Former employees who worked alongside her during those years have reportedly been re-interviewed. Not once, not twice, multiple occasions, each session penetrating deeper into the identical territory. What did she comprehend? When did she comprehend it? What documents passed through her possession? What did she authorize, and what did she permit others to authorize on her behalf? Those are not casual inquiries. Those are the inquiries you pose when you're constructing something. And here's the detail that nobody is leading with, but should be. The Trump Organization's financial methodologies didn't exist in isolation. They were a system, a methodology, and Ivanka wasn't merely adjacent to that system during her executive years. She was embedded in it, operating projects, approving valuations, interfacing with lenders and partners who relied on the financial picture being presented to them. If that picture was fraudulent, and a court already determined that it was, the inquiry becomes who comprehended it was fraudulent and what role did each person execute in producing it. That inquiry doesn't have a comfortable resolution for Ivanka. Let's discuss the specific deals that keep surfacing, because this is where the story gets granular and where the legal risk becomes tangible. The Trump International Hotel and Tower in Chicago. Ivanka was deeply involved in that project. She worked on marketing it, on the financial projections presented to investors and lenders, on the public-facing materials that describe the development's potential. When that project encountered trouble, when loans became complicated, when the financial picture shifted, those early representations became exhibit material. Then there are the licensing deals. The Trump Organization's international expansion during the period Ivanka was active involved negotiations with foreign development partners. Those negotiations required financial disclosures, representations about the company's stability and asset base. The same inflated financial statements that formed the basis of the New York civil fraud case were being utilized in those international conversations. Ivanka was in rooms where those conversations occurred. Her signature appears on documents connected to those deals. Her sign-off was part of the process in a way that's difficult to separate from the underlying representations being made. And then there's the White House period. This is where it gets genuinely complicated, because Ivanka, serving as a senior advisor while maintaining financial interests in deals that were moving forward simultaneously, creates a web of potential violations that go beyond state-level civil fraud. Federal ethics requirements, foreign business entanglement rules, the emoluments clause, considerations that never fully got resolved. Multiple investigations touched these issues during the Trump administration. Most of them were quietly shelved or delayed. They didn't disappear. They went into files that are now being reopened. One legal analyst who specializes in white-collar financial cases described it this way: when you have a fraud finding at the organizational level, every executive who was part of that organization's financial decision-making becomes a potential subject. The question is always resource and priority. Prosecutors decide who to pursue and when. The timing has shifted. Here's the moment everything accelerated. And this is what makes the current situation different from everything that came before. The New York civil fraud verdict didn't just punish Donald Trump. It established a factual record. 400 pages of documented findings about how the Trump Organization operated, how its financial statements were produced, how its valuations were manipulated, and who was in positions of authority during the period when all of this was happening. That factual record is now a resource. Every investigation that touches the Trump Organization in any context can draw on those findings. Prosecutors in other jurisdictions, investigators pursuing different threads, even civil plaintiffs in unrelated cases, all of them now have a court-validated map of how the organization worked and who was involved. Ivanka appears in that map. Not in the final judgment, because she wasn't a defendant in that specific action, but in the underlying record, in the testimony, in the documentary evidence. Her name and her role come up repeatedly. And Letitia James's office isn't the only one who built that map. The January 6th committee built one of its own. Federal prosecutors in Washington built one. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which is running a separate criminal investigation into Trump Organization finances, built one. Those maps are being cross-referenced right now. When you overlay them, certain names appear in multiple places. Van Guest's name is one of them. That's not speculation. That's what happens when you spend years documenting how a family business operated and who had what authority during which period. Now, let's hear the other side, because there's always another side, and dismissing it would be dishonest. Ivanka's defenders have a case, and it's not a weak one. She left the White House in January 2021 and has kept an exceptionally low profile since. She wasn't a defendant in the civil fraud case. Her father's legal team repeatedly emphasized that she stepped away from day-to-day Trump Organization operations before many of the most problematic financial statements were finalized. Her own lawyers have consistently maintained that she operated within legal boundaries and sought counsel on ethics and conflict of interest questions during her White House tenure. There's also a legitimate question about prosecutorial priorities. Multiple critics across the political spectrum have noted that using the legal system to pursue family members of political opponents, even where genuine legal questions exist, creates dangerous precedent. Where does accountability end and political targeting begin? That line matters in a democracy. It matters a great deal. And some legal analysts point out that Ivanka's specific involvement in the financial statements that formed the core of the civil fraud case is harder to document than her father's and her brother's. She was an executive, yes, but the specific representations to banks and insurance companies that Judge Engoron found fraudulent, tracking her personal role in those is more complicated than it sounds. Her supporters argue she's being pursued as a proxy, that going after the daughter is another way of going after the father. That investigators who couldn't get a criminal conviction against Trump himself are looking for leverage wherever they can find it. And here's the uncomfortable thing. They're not entirely wrong to raise that concern. The use of prosecutorial power against political families has an ugly history that doesn't belong exclusively to one political party. Acknowledging the legitimate legal exposure doesn't require pretending that prosecutorial discretion is always exercised purely. Both things can be true simultaneously. There can be genuine legal questions about Ivanka's conduct and genuine questions about whether those legal questions are being pursued with appropriate consistency. That tension doesn't resolve easily. And anyone who tells you it does is selling you something. But here's what cuts through the political noise: the documents. Legal observers who have reviewed materials connected to the current proceedings describe a paper trail that is specific, dated, and detailed. Not vague references to Ivanka being present in meetings, actual documents, actual sign-offs, actual communications that connect her to specific representations made to specific parties during specific transactions. That's different from political exposure. Political exposure is what happens when investigators decide to focus on someone for strategic reasons. Documentary exposure is what happens when someone's signature is on something that turned out to be fraudulent. The distinction matters enormously in a courtroom. Prosecutors don't win cases on proximity and association. They win them on documents. And the current reporting from multiple outlets that have viewed portions of the relevant materials suggests the documentary record is denser than Ivanka's public positioning implied. Her legal team reportedly includes some of the most sophisticated, white-collar defense attorneys in the country. The kind you hire when you think the threat is real, not the kind you hire to make a public statement. That choice speaks its own language, and the recent subpoenas, the ones that triggered the current wave of reporting, aren't exploratory fishing expeditions. Legal experts with experience in how these investigations work say the specificity of the document requests indicates a focused inquiry. Investigators who know what they're looking for because they already have enough to know where to look. That's a fundamentally different posture than early-stage investigation. That's late stage. Let's talk about what's actually at stake, because people are focusing on the legal drama and missing the bigger picture. Ivanka Trump has spent the years since leaving Washington methodically rebuilding a life and an identity separate from the political and legal storm surrounding her family. She's in Miami. She's focused on her children, on philanthropic work, on staying out of the headlines. By most accounts, she's succeeded at creating distance. That distance is now collapsing because you can't separate yourself from a legal proceeding by moving to Florida. You can't outrun a subpoena with good public relations. The strategy that worked in the court of public opinion, staying quiet, staying away, letting time pass, that strategy doesn't work when investigators have your documents and want to ask you about them under oath. And under oath is the critical phrase, because everything Ivanka has said publicly, every carefully worded statement about her White House ethics compliance, every distanced comment about the Trump Organization's legal battles, all of that gets tested against what she says under oath and what the documents say. If there's a gap between the public narrative and the sworn testimony, that gap becomes a problem unto itself. Investigators who find that gap don't close the case. They open a new one. Former prosecutors with experience in high-profile white-collar cases describe this as the compression moment, the point in an investigation when the subject's options start narrowing. Cooperation looks more attractive. Silence becomes more expensive. The decisions made in the next weeks and months determine everything that follows. Whether Ivanka is at that compression moment right now is something only her legal team knows for certain. But the external signals, the subpoena activity, the document requests, the reported re-interviewing of witnesses, those are the signals that typically precede it. Here's what nobody is saying out loud yet, and it needs to be said. If this investigation reaches the point of charges, and that's still an if, not a certainty, it changes the entire political landscape in ways that go far beyond Ivanka herself. She has spent years being positioned by her own actions and by those around her as the Trump most capable of political rehabilitation, the one who could eventually return to public life in a way that transcended the current moment. That positioning is fragile. Legal proceedings of any kind shatter it completely. But more than her personal political future, her potential legal exposure creates strategic complications for the broader Trump political operation. How do you run a campaign or build a movement when a core family member is facing active legal jeopardy? How do you present a unified front when every legal development involving one family member becomes a story about all of them? Every story about the investigation, including this one, adds to a record that potential jurors will have encountered if this ever reaches trial. Every statement Ivanka makes gets analyzed for what it implies about her legal posture. The silence she's maintained, which served her well for years, now reads differently against the backdrop of active legal scrutiny. Her supporters are urging her to go on offense, to push back publicly the way her father does, to claim persecution, to fundraise on the outrage, to use the investigation as political fuel. But Ivanka's entire brand was built on not being that kind of figure, on being the sophisticated contrast. If she goes to war the way her father goes to war, she loses the image that distinguished her. If she stays quiet, the legal pressure accumulates without a public counter-narrative. There's no clean choice, only a series of difficult ones being made in real time. And here's what's keeping her legal team up at night, the thing that makes this situation genuinely different from everything that came before. The civil fraud verdict against her father created something unprecedented, a judicial finding, detailed and specific, that the Trump Organization operated as a fraudulent enterprise for years. That finding didn't name Ivanka as a participant, but it described an organization, a culture, a methodology that she was part of for a significant period. When prosecutors or investigators in any jurisdiction now look at conduct connected to the Trump Organization during that period, they have a court-validated framework for understanding what they're looking at. They're not starting from scratch trying to prove that financial statements were manipulated. That's already been established. They're starting from an established foundation and building toward individual accountability. That's a fundamentally different investigative posture than existed 2 years ago. The ground shifted under everyone in that organization's orbit. Most of them were peripheral enough that it didn't matter. Ivanka wasn't peripheral. She was central. One former federal prosecutor described this dynamic with a phrase that's been circulating in legal circles: the umbrella has been pulled away. Everyone who was standing under the organizational umbrella, protected by its complexity and by the difficulty of proving fraud at any individual level, they're all in the rain now. Ivanka is in the rain. So where does this end? That's the question everyone is asking, and the truthful answer is that nobody knows. The investigations could produce charges, or they could produce nothing. The documents could tell a story that demands prosecution, or they could reveal complexity that makes prosecution impractical. The legal system could move quickly, or it could take years. What we know with certainty is simpler and more sobering. Ivanka Trump is no longer watching from a safe distance. The legal proceedings that she spent years carefully avoiding, that her legal team spent years carefully maneuvering around, they have arrived at her door. The subpoenas are real. The document requests are real. The investigative focus is real. The image she built, the distance she maintained, the carefully constructed narrative of the family member who escaped the storm, that image is being stress-tested in a way it has never been before. And unlike public relations challenges where a well-crafted statement can shift a narrative, legal challenges don't respond to messaging. They respond to evidence. And the evidence is what it is. Her father called his legal battles persecution and turned them into a political identity. Her brothers took the stand and fought it in court. Ivanka has tried a third path, staying above it, staying out, staying quiet. That path just narrowed dramatically. In the coming weeks, decisions will be made in legal offices, in conference rooms, and courtrooms that Ivanka cannot control. Documents will be reviewed that contain her name and her signature and her decisions made in years when the Trump organization was operating the way a court later found it operated. And somewhere in those documents is the answer to the question that defines everything that comes next. How close was she really? How much did she know? How deeply is her signature embedded in the paper trail that already cost her family hundreds of millions of dollars? The investigation knows, the legal teams know, the documents know. We're about to find out. Whatever comes next, one thing is already certain. The exit Ivanka Trump thought she'd made, the clean break, the new chapter in Miami, the sophisticated distance from her family's legal nightmare, that exit has been closed. The door has swung shut behind her. There is no turning back now. And when this breaks open, and it will break open, nothing about what happens next will be what anyone predicted. The most carefully managed image in American political life is about to face its most unmanageable moment. And we're all watching to see what's left when the paper trail runs out. The clock isn't just ticking, it's echoing. Every day that passes without resolution adds another layer of pressure to a situation that was already suffocating. Ivanka's legal team is working around the clock, reviewing documents, preparing responses, calculating risks that most people will never fully understand from the outside. But here's what experienced legal observers know that casual news consumers don't. When an investigation reaches this stage, when the subpoenas are specific and the document requests are granular, the momentum almost never reverses. It builds. And the build is what should concern everyone watching this story, because investigations that reach this level of documented specificity don't quietly dissolve. They either produce accountability or they produce a story about why they didn't. Either way, Ivanka's name is permanently attached to that outcome. Her silence, once a strength, is now being read differently by everyone in the room. Prosecutors read silence as calculation. Investigators read it as preservation. The public reads it as something between dignity and distance. But in a legal proceeding, silence is never actually quiet. It speaks volumes to the people trained to listen. Something is moving beneath the surface of this story that hasn't broken into public view yet. Sources close to the proceedings describe a pace of activity that suggests decisions are approaching faster than official timelines indicate. When the next development drops, it won't arrive with warning. It never does at this stage. It will simply land. And everything changes the moment it does. Here's what I want you to sit with before you close this video. Ivanka Trump didn't build her image by accident. She built it brick by brick, decision by decision, over decades of calculated positioning. The polished interviews, the carefully worded statements, the strategic retreats at exactly the right moments. That took discipline, that took intelligence, that took an understanding of how public perception works that most people in our world completely lack. And none of it matters inside a courtroom, because courtrooms don't care about image. They care about documents. They care about signatures. They care about what you knew, when you knew it, and what you did with that knowledge. Every carefully constructed public narrative collapses the moment it meets a paper trail that tells a different story. That's the world Ivanka is living in right now. Not the world of press releases and philanthropic appearances and Miami sunsets. The world of depositions and document reviews and legal strategies that cost more per hour than most people earn in a month. The question that defines everything going forward isn't whether she's guilty or innocent. Courts decide that. The question is whether the distance she worked so hard to create was real, or whether it was always an illusion maintained by circumstances that have now fundamentally changed. We're going to find out sooner than most people expect. If this story matters to you, if you believe accountability should follow evidence regardless of who that evidence points toward, then stay close to this one. Share it with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening beneath the headlines, because the full story isn't finished yet. Not even close. And when the next chapter lands, you'll want to have been paying attention from the beginning.